Muy buenos días, amigos y amigas, bienvenidos a la primera sesión del seminario Ensamblajes y Movilidades. El seminario es una iniciativa del grupo de investigación en ciencias sociales y tecnología, el grupo de investigación Yactalá Ciudades Sustentables y el grupo de investigación Caleidos de la Universidad de Cuenca. Estamos muy contentos de poder hacer este seminario internacional virtual que nos ha permitido precisamente llegar a muchísimas personas y sobre todo contar con panelistas extraordinarios, tengo que decirle, tres investigadores y un investigador internacionales de primera, que nos van a compartir precisamente sus perspectivas y sus experiencias de investigación en temas de ensamble entre la ciudad, la infraestructura y la movilidad. El día de hoy vamos a hacer la inauguración, comenzaremos con las primeras presentaciones. Estará con nosotros Geneviéve Biosjoly del Politécnico de Montreal, y como panelista nacional estará la investigadora María Laura Guerrero de las Ciudades Sustentables de la Universidad de Cuenca. La sesión de hoy va a ser en inglés. Esta primera sesión es en inglés, las siguientes sesiones van a ser en idioma español. El día de hoy empezaremos también con la inauguración, con la presencia de nuestra señora rectora de la Universidad de Cuenca, María Augusta Hermida, a quien damos la bienvenida y pedimos que nos dirija unas palabras tanto a las personas que están conectadas directamente en el seminario como a quienes nos siguen a través de las redes sociales.
Buenos días, queridos compañeros. Es un honor para mí volver a encontrarme con muchos de ustedes, con quienes hemos venido trabajando todos estos últimos años. Empezar felicitando al grupo, a los grupos organizadores de este evento. Es fundamental para el desarrollo de los temas de sostenibilidad urbana. Por eso quiero dar la bienvenida especialmente a los expositores internacionales, a los expositores nacionales también, de parte de la Universidad de Cuenca, y mucho más ahora que estamos en la dirección de la institución. Queremos asegurarles que tienen las puertas abiertas para llevar adelante iniciativas como la presente. Sabemos que el siglo XXI es un siglo que está lleno de nuevos desafíos, particularmente en los temas de ciudad. La ciudad, como saben, es un sistema complejo y demanda esta mirada interdisciplinar para poder resolver sus grandes problemas. Creo que desde las instituciones de educación superior estamos avanzando en la construcción de estos nuevos paradigmas que nos permitirán solucionar estos problemas complejos, particularmente el tema de la movilidad. La movilidad y su relación con la forma urbana tienen que ser temas a debatir, a discutir, a investigar. Necesitamos la generación de datos para la posibilidad de construir política pública pertinente. Les doy la bienvenida y espero que este seminario sea un éxito. Créanme que les envidio. Me da mucha pena no poder estar participando activamente como investigadora junto con ustedes, pero desde el rectorado estaremos pendientes del avance de este seminario y sobre todo de sus grandes conclusiones. Un abrazo a todos.
Muchísimas gracias, Augusta, y estoy seguro de que te hubiera gustado muchísimo poder participar más tiempo en este seminario. De todas maneras, ya estaremos conversando. Yo creo que con esto estamos fortaleciendo muchísimo las redes internacionales que tenemos y poniendo también nuestro grano de arena como Universidad de Cuenca, produciendo evidencia científica, produciendo investigación de alta calidad para la toma de decisiones, para la construcción de ciudades más justas, más resilientes y más humanas para el siglo XXI. Muchísimas gracias por tus palabras, y así damos comienzo al seminario el día de hoy. Muy bien, vamos a dar, quisiera dar solamente unas pequeñas indicaciones de cómo vamos a funcionar en este seminario, en esta primera sesión, así como las siguientes sesiones. El seminario está organizado por el Departamento Interdisciplinario de Espacio y Población de la Universidad de Cuenca y cuenta con la participación de los grupos de investigación de Yactalab, Ciudades Sustentables, con el grupo de investigación de estudios sociales de ciencia y tecnología, con el grupo de investigación Caleidos, que es el Centro de Etnografía Interdisciplinaria. La intención de este seminario ha sido precisamente traer a la mesa de discusión nuevas perspectivas de estudios urbanos que nos permiten entender ese ensamblaje precisamente entre la infraestructura, la ciudad, la sociedad y la movilidad. Las nuevas preguntas que se plantean para las ciudades del siglo XXI son preguntas complejas por definición, en el sentido que requieren diversos puntos de vista, diversas aproximaciones. Ya las respuestas desde las disciplinas exclusivamente no son suficientes y necesitamos ampliarlas. Yo creo que esto es lo que la intención que tenemos con este seminario y contrastar también las visiones y la investigación que se hace a nivel internacional, por eso tenemos 4 panelistas internacionales para nuestras sesiones, con la investigación que se hace en Ecuador, con la investigación que se hace localmente. Por lo tanto, contamos también con 4 panelistas nacionales que nos darán también la perspectiva de investigación local. Durante el seminario, las personas que están asistiendo pueden realizar sus preguntas utilizando la función del chat que tiene la plataforma Zoom, y al final de cada presentación vamos a tener una discusión un poco más abierta precisamente sobre estos contenidos, así que les invitamos también a participar. Si es que alguna persona de la misma manera prefiere hacer su pregunta directamente a los panelistas, a los expositores, nos puede avisar de la misma manera por el chat y le daremos directamente la palabra. Quisiera también indicarles la sesión de hoy es en inglés. Esta es la única sesión en inglés del seminario, las otras 3 sesiones van a ser en idioma español. También el Departamento de Espacio y Población emitirá un certificado de asistencia al seminario a las personas que asistan al menos al 75% de las sesiones, es decir, a 3 de las 4 sesiones del seminario. Para esto, al finalizar el seminario, enviaremos por el chat un link en el cual ustedes van a poder acceder a un formulario para registrar sus datos, quienes deseen este certificado de participación. El seminario y el certificado no tienen costos, son completamente gratuitos, lo único que requieren hacer es completar esta información en el momento que termine la sesión. Con esto entonces vamos a dar inicio, vamos a tener primero la participación de María Laura Guerrero, y en este momento ya para iniciar oficialmente la parte académica voy a cambiar a inglés de manera de hacer las presentaciones correspondientes. María Laura Guerrero is an architect by the University of Cuenca. She graduated in 2015 and holds a Master in Research in Spatial Design, Architecture and Cities and Space Syntax at the University College of London this year. She has worked as a researcher here in our group, Yactalab Ciudades Sustentables, since 2018, and her research experience is mainly related to mobility, spatial analysis, and data analysis. María Laura will be sharing our research from the Yactalab Research Group related to mobility analysis and collaboration with local authorities to inform the design and public policies related to mobility. From the international side, will be with us Geneviéve Biosjoly. She's assistant professor in transport engineering at the Polytechnic of Montreal. Building on her multidisciplinary background in mechanical engineering, sustainability science, and urban planning, she's concerned with interactions between transport networks, land use, and travel behavior from a sustainability standpoint. She has developed an extensive expertise related to indicators of access to urban opportunities or the integration with urban planning. More specifically, she works on the needs and perceptions of users and on how to include them in integrated land use and transportation planning tools. Her work focuses and active public transportation modes, travel behavior, and social equity. She's a professor in the Polytechnic of Montreal and has led several projects on sustainable mobility and accessibility. Specifically in Montreal, mainly for the City of Montreal and the Authority Regional of Transport Metropolitan Transportation. The title of Genevieve's presentation will be Accessibility Indicators for land use and transport planning, how to capture the differentiated needs of individuals while foresting the adoption in practice. So we'll start with María Laura. María Laura, welcome for your presentation. This first presentation will be 10 minutes, and after that, we'll continue Genevieve with her presentation. Please go on.
Thank you, Daniel. Right on, just let me share my screen. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and also to Daniel for the presentation. My name is María Laura. I am a researcher at the YACTA Lab Sustainable Cities Group. Today, I am going to show you a little bit about our contributions to mobility research and how we've collaborated with local authorities to inform design and public policy on mobility. For a little conceptual context, YACTA Lab's field of incidence is somehow broad. We've focused on producing some analysis and answers for the main 21st century challenges that our cities will face for reaching sustainability, like urban sprawl, climate change, resource depletion, socioeconomic inequality, health and well-being, and information and knowledge management. All these challenges are transversally crossed by urban topics like the built environment, the morphology of cities, the way we inhabit them and our habits, mobility of people and resources, ecology, governance, and others. This is a model to illustrate the conceptual framework in which our scope and work take place. To simplify these concepts, our approach is to look at the city and our way of life as two interdependent factors that are constantly influencing and changing each other. What happens in one affects the other. In this way, we can see ourselves as a part of our environment, which gives us a more holistic approach to understand our actions in the city. We've organized our work on mobility in three main axes. The first one is to study our behavioral patterns and perceptions in the urban environments. The second one has to do with a more technical approach to developing, or more accurately, adapting tools for analyzing mobility. The third one has to do with what to do with the knowledge produced by the other two. So it focuses on translating analysis into design and public policy proposals. So today I am going to tell you a little bit about our projects. I am not going to focus on scientific hardcore results, but more on the processes we followed as a group to make our research useful for our community. The first project has to do with designing safe routes to school for children. This project was made in response to a hypothesis in which very concerning indicators about child overweight and obesity pointed out not only to personal bad habits, but more to environments that promoted obesity by banning children from using urban space. As you can see in the image, the surroundings of the school at the left are not the most inviting or safe for walking. For this project, a tool developed internationally by Salis in 2012, I believe, was adapted and scientifically validated for a Latin American context. This tool was optimized to collect information by developing a mobile phone form. The main goal of the tool is to produce a micro-scale assessment of walkability by collecting very detailed information of pedestrian infrastructure and obstacles per street segment. In the end, the tool created an index which allows us to see how walkable streets are. A rough interpretation of this map, colored as a semaphore, shows that almost no streets are green, meaning walkable. With this evidence, we proposed a project for designing complete streets, which went from current state to an ideal design to promote a safe displacement for children and food around their school. I am happy to announce that just last week, the team gained financing to develop the second part of this project, which will physically implement interventions to adapt a sample of school environments. And this team will also have members of the local administration to ensure a close and fruitful collaboration in this topic. The second project that I'm going to talk about is one of our most famous ones. It attempted to propose a solution for mobility problems in one of the most conflictive intersections in the city, quite near the university we work, and in one of the most traditional neighborhoods in town, El Vado. It is worth saying that this project was developed by two very talented young researchers, Matías Cardoso and Caridad Pineda, as their undergrad dissertation, and the process and graphics you will see is a product of their work in collaboration with senior researchers and directors in the group. So the project started with a succinct analysis of behavior patterns of sustainable mobility in the intersection, adapting tools from How to Study Public Life by Young Gell. This analysis allowed to detect the main problems from informal crossings to long distances to danger zones. Also, a perception analysis was made with a focus group to understand what users think and need in this area. The analysis finally produced three seemingly simple objectives, which would guide the design. The first, connecting cycleways. The second, providing safe pedestrian crossings where there were none. And the third, narrowing crossing distances so people could calmly cross in the semaphoric intervals. Then, a collaborative design process started with a big team that gathered academics, students, and staff from the mobility department in the local administration in an iterative manner that improved the design weekly for a few months. Next, the implementation phase came, in which a group of volunteer students, researchers, friends, and municipality workers cooperated to translate the design into a physical intervention. This is an aerial view of the result and how people are using it. And of course, an assessment phase came in which we compared before and after scenarios. As we can see, the design increased and organized flows, and we can see also how perception polls show the approval of the population. Local authorities were happy with the results and decided to make the intervention permanent. Sadly, the pandemic and the economic crisis it brought came before it could be permanently built, but we are hoping that soon it will become a reality. The final project is for the city of Ambato. Ambato is another intermediate Andean city in Ecuador. It has quite a particular topography since it develops in 5 terraces at different heights. Ambato's local administration needed to implement some kilometers of pedestrian and cycling infrastructure as a response to the pandemic that affected the public transport system so much, to provide a safe and sustainable alternative for mobility to face the crisis. For this, we deployed a combination of our methodologies from space syntax to accessibility opportunities to land use analysis to propose a network for the whole city, with the aggregated difficulty of not being able to travel to actually see the city we were working on, which was quite a challenge that we faced with a small on-site team that helped us contextualize and ground our work. We made a thorough behavioral analysis as well, in different days and different demographic characteristics as gender. In the end, we proposed a network that started in the city center, in strong red, a second stage of a sort of tentacles that spread to the terraces, and a third phase in pale rose that connected residential areas to the center through the tentacles. Finally, the first phase was also implemented using tactical urbanism and monitored for 3 weeks. As we know, the local administration has very recently also decided to make it permanent. We've published most of our work in prestigious scientific journals, but also we produce some great literature, manuals, to give people a roadmap for someone who wants to implement these kinds of projects themselves. We've also made an effort to have some media presence, which has gotten us closer to different stakeholders of the urban environment. Finally, if I can leave you with a final reflection, is mainly the effort to try as much as possible to create a close relation between local authorities and academia to collaborate in urban processes to inform decisions and design. And also I must highlight the richness in the participation of different levels in academia, like researchers and students, and the collaboration and the opinions of the community as well, as goals that should guide our work in favor of our communities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, María Laura, for the presentation and for this huge effort to condense all this research on just a few minutes. I just want to remember you all. You can ask your questions in the chat or using the questions and answer the preguntas y respuestas tool here in the platform. Now going on, we will go back with Genevieve. Genevieve, thank you very, very much for joining us. So the stand is for you. Genevieve will talk us a little bit about her research on accessibility indicators. Please go on.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much to Daniel and María Laura for the invitation. It's great to participate in the webinar that addresses a difficult challenge of bringing together a different perspective. So I'm glad I can take part in this challenge. And thank you, María Laura, for your presentation. I think it links really well with what I'm going to talk about the macro level and then the micro level of what people need and want in their trips. So let me start sharing my presentation. So you can all see my presentation. Great. So as Daniel mentioned, my main research interest is into land use and transport perspective, and more specifically understanding how they contribute to, or how they influence the travel behavior of individuals and how they contribute to their well-being in different aspects. And today I'm going to briefly present about accessibility indicators. First, why is it important and how it can contribute to planning? Then I'm going to go on about defining a bit the concept and describing how it can be measured. And I'm going to conclude with how is it adopted in planning practice, which will lead to the question of how to balance the needs between the planning perspective and then having the best measure possible that capture what we want to capture. So I don't have an answer to that question. It's an open question that I'm happy to reflect on with you. So I often start my course or presentation on accessibility with this question about what characterizes a good transportation system. And most often what I get for answers are answers like reliability, speed, efficiency of the transport system. And these are all very important aspects, but what's often missed out is really the finality of trips, which is we want people to be able to access their destinations, right? So that's what we focus on when we talk about accessibility. The main characteristic of a transportation system is that it should bring people to where they want to go. So people move to cities or to villages to have access to those opportunities. Here's a picture of downtown Montreal. So they want to access job opportunities, cultural activities, leisure activities. So that's ice skating in Montreal and some, for example, educational opportunities. So that's what people want to do, and that's what we want to achieve with the transportation system to allow them to access those destinations. And to get to those destinations, well, there's some challenges. So congestion that we often talk about. There can be also some discomfort related to the pedestrian or bicycle lane, as María Laura presented in her presentation. And that's what we often focus on in public debate, for example, especially car congestion. Whereas what we want is the activity, right? The goal of doing a trip is to do an activity, and this activity is dispersed across the territory, so we need to access this activity. And the trip is simply a mean to an end, okay? So that's where accessibility comes in, to distinguish between the trip itself, which we have focused on quite a bit in the last decade, and the end, which is accessibility, right? So I'll repeat the word accessibility quite often in this presentation. Hopefully it will stick in your mind. So what does it mean to plan based on accessibility rather than mobility, which is often done or has been done traditionally? So mobility is really oriented toward the flow, the speed, mainly of vehicles, okay? And that's where approaches have been developed to model traffic flows, traffic circulation on the road networks. Whereas accessibility is really about people and destination. So instead of focusing on the flows, we focus on people and where they want to go. And this implies that we reorder how we think about the modes. And I like it because I saw in one of the press release that Maria showed, there was a Piramida del Movilidad. So I think it relates to that, if I understand it correctly. So basically, what's the most efficient modes in terms of space, land use, energy, health even? Well, we start from the top. So walking, cycling, public transport really are more efficient in terms of addressing the needs of an individual, and it's more inclusive as well. And then we go on with car sharing and private vehicle. And the electric vehicle would also be more or less at the bottom of the pyramid, maybe just before the conventional car, but it's still not the solution that will solve accessibility. So giving priority to these modes allows us to ensure a more efficient transport planning that can help people reach their destination. But there's some limitations to that. So if we talk about walking and cycling, which are often used together with public transport, well, these are slow modes and they need to be combined with something else to be efficient, right? So I have a picture here of Manitoba, which is a rural province in Canada. And I often give the example, if you put a bicycle lane here, it won't improve your access to destination by much, right? It won't, there's not much around. So moving around by public transport, walking, cycling might not be efficient. Whereas I have the extreme example on the bottom right here of Manhattan, Times Square. So here you have a lot of destinations. So if you improve the walking and cycling infrastructure, well, there you might really see improvement in access to destination, and the same go with for public transport. So this brings us to the short conceptual definition of accessibility, which depends on the transport system. So here I have a map of the metro system in Montreal, but it also depends on where opportunities or destinations are located on the territory. So basically, it can be simply defined as the ease with which land use activities can be reached from a location using a particular transport system. So it really emphasizes the bridge between transport and land use planning. So those are the two components that are widely discussed when it comes to accessibility. But there's a third one that's nonetheless important, which is the individual component, right? So not all individuals will experience the land use and transport system in the same way. It can be children, adults. There's some difference also related to gender. Here is a small analysis that Metrolinx, which is the transit agencies in Toronto, did by trying to categorize different segments of their users based on their needs, preference, which will affect how satisfied they will be with the system, and it will affect what are their perceived accessibility to destination using the system. So this brings us to the fact that accessibility is a multi-dimensional concept. So it brings together land use, transport, and individuals. And that's why this concept is so helpful, as it really tackles at the same time different aspects. It's also a challenge to implement it in practice, since we're so much rooted into mobility practices, which mainly concern the transport component. Now we have a multi-dimensional concept, which requires some efforts to be able to operationalize this concept into indicators or measures that can be applied to evaluate the performance of a system. So I'll speak briefly here about different ways of measuring accessibility. So I won't spend too much time on that, but I want to make sure we're on the same page with that. So here's a simple example, the simplest measure we could say that can be used to really reflect the ease of reaching destination. And it's called the cumulative opportunity measure because basically it simply counts the destinations that you can access. And it's location based because it's calculated for a specific origin. So basically it can be referred to the following question: how many opportunities or destinations can be reached from a specific location, for example, someone's house, using a specific mode under a specific travel distance or travel time. And here we have an example in red for walking. So for example, from someone's house, within 20 minutes of walking, someone can access everything that's in the red circle. So there are 3 opportunities. Whereas with public transport from the same house within also 20 minutes, we can access a bit more destinations. So here we have an accessibility of 5 destinations. So this is a quite common, easy to interpret and operationalize definition of accessibility. And it directly reflects how the land use and transport together contribute to accessibility. So here are some examples of analysis we did mainly in the region here in Montreal and Quebec City. So first example is we calculated accessibility to jobs by public transport to have an idea of how well each area in the city is connected to activities, right, to economic activities in the region. And for this, we used 45 minutes travel time threshold at 8 a.m. So basically it's how well can you access economic opportunities in the morning peak using public transport. And so you only need to access one job normally, but the access to a variety of opportunities reflects how well you're connected to activities in the areas. And here we see that the greater accessibility is in red. So areas near the metro stations and the metro lines have access to a greater number of jobs within 45 minutes, which makes sense. And here the title is regular accessibility because we did the same thing, but asked the question, what would be the accessibility of an individual in a wheelchair? And to do that, we excluded all stations, stops, and vehicles that are not accessible for individuals in a wheelchair. And that's where the individual component comes in. And we see a dramatic drop in accessibility. Okay, so it shows that the regular accessibility might not reflect the actual level of accessibility that is experienced by all individuals in the region. So it can be related to individuals in a wheelchair, but there's also many people that are affected by the absence of elevators. For example, people with strollers, people with kids, people with groceries, with luggages. So there's a lot of people that can be affected by this diminished accessibility. Also here, we only excluded stations and vehicles that are non-accessible for people in a wheelchair, but we did not change the walking access to transit stations. So that might be another thing to look into. There might be some trips from distances to stations that are not appropriate for individuals in a wheelchair or that require more time. So that could also be considered in future more detailed analysis. I'll show you here another example of accessibility to parks in Quebec City. So that's the second largest city in the province of Quebec. And here what we were interested in was to compare the accessibility provided to cyclists and pedestrians using different networks. So what we show here is, so the colors represent the number of parks or green spaces that are accessible from each residential lot. And in light yellow, basically, that's where people have no access to any parks within 1 kilometer of walking. And for these calculations, we used the pedestrian network, but also the calm residential road without sidewalk, because this is quite common in Quebec City, and people use it to travel. So we wanted to compare the level of accessibility by including those calm streets and excluding those calm streets without sidewalk. And what we see again is a dramatic drop in accessibility, right? And yes, those residential streets are used by pedestrians, but it doesn't mean that they're safe for pedestrians. So these are wide suburban streets where car can travel at quite high speeds. So it's a big overestimation of accessibility for pedestrians, especially for children, to include the road networks or the calm residential street. And then we wanted to look into cycling. So we used the cycling network, so the cycling links and the calm residential streets, but we excluded the boulevards with no specific bicycle lanes, especially since we were interested in children. And we see gaps in accessibility that are more important than when you include all the pedestrian network. So this relates mainly to some boulevards having, yes, sidewalks, but no space for cyclists, and cyclists are not allowed to cycle on the sidewalks. So it leaves them with few options to ride safely on these links. So this illustrates, again, the nuances of accessibility depending on what links do you include in. That's where María Laura's study was interesting, because you could characterize the links and see which one would you include in your accessibility calculation, for example. So if you exclude all the ones that are characterized with a low or a red color, then you could see the accessibility, and it can help you see which links should you prioritize in bringing to the green, for example. And the last example here is more related to the type of destinations that you can consider in your accessibility measures. And so here we again calculated accessibility to parks in the city of Montreal. And first of all, we looked at playgrounds. So here from each residential lots, you have the number of playgrounds that someone can access in 1 kilometer. And we see that the accessibility is quite well distributed across the city, with most residential areas having access to 3 or more parks. Then we looked at different type of amenities that can be found in parks. So here it's open air activities, which maybe cater more to young adults or teenagers than to family with young children. And we can see that this accessibility is much lower and concentrated in specific areas, right? So calculated accessibility to parks and green spaces is one thing, but if you want to understand more specifically one issue, then you need to go more into details. So I could go on for a very long time with different types of accessibility measures. It depends on the modes, on the networks, on the people that use it, on the destinations that they're interested in. But I'll stop here for now. I think I gave you quite an idea of how we can go in different directions to obtain more nuance and more details. And I'll conclude the presentation with a section on how are accessibility measures actually included in planning. So what I showed you is mostly related to what's being done in research. There's a lot of research trying to improve and develop measures that more accurately reflect the reality and the perceptions. But then I want to focus on what is being done in planning. So we did a study of 32 metropolitan land use and transport plans, mainly in North America, Europe, and Australia because of language barriers. So we looked at plans that were in English and in French. And what we found is that accessibility is included in most plans. So here is an example from the Los Angeles Regional Transportation Plan, which is largely structured around the car. And we see that in their subtitle and also in one of their goals, they talk about accessibility. However, it's often used as a buzzword. So as in this case, it's used together with the concept of mobility, and it's not clearly defined or used distinctly from mobility. So what we saw is that most planners or most people that develop these plans are aware of the importance of accessibility, that it's not only about mobility, but then when it comes to really applying it in practice, it's another story. So just briefly focus here on the red arrows, just to show that out of the 32 plans that we looked at, only 7 had access to destinations included as main indicators in the plans, okay? So I won't go into details into all the other ways that it was included or not, but it's just to show that there's really not that many that do include access to destination indicators. In parallel to this study, we did a survey among planners, mainly in the US and in Canada, to inquire about how do they use accessibility in their work. The first finding here is if you look at the 2 first rows, so we asked them whether they were familiar with the concept and the metrics of accessibility, and we found that around 80% were familiar, did agree with those statements. And then we asked them whether they use the concept, so the third row, and whether they use the metrics in their work. And here we see a big difference between using the concept and using the metrics, which is in line with what we found in the plans, right? So people do talk about accessibility, are interested in it, but then when it comes to measuring it, either qualitatively or quantitatively, it's another story. It also relates to how it's included in planning documents. So we asked them whether the concept, the goals, and indicators were included in the planning documents that they work with. And here again, we see big differences between the concept, which is about 75% of the respondents said that the concept of accessibility was included in their working document, whereas only 37% said that clearly defined indicators were included in their planning documents. And an important thing to mention here is that the survey was disseminated with a convenience sample, so it probably overrepresents people that are using and are interested in the metrics. Then we asked people that do use accessibility metrics, what kind of metrics do they use? And again, we saw a high proportion of people using travel time proxy, density proxy, and land use proxy, which alone do not reflect the ease of reaching destination. So it's not to say that they're not interesting indicators, they are relevant, but they do not directly measure accessibility. Another concerning result that we found is that when we asked, so if you look at the blue rows, when we asked accessibility to which type of destinations is measured, the first one that comes is the public transit stop. And that's mainly a measure of transit coverage rather than a measure of access to destination. And here again, an example from rural Canada. So you might have access to a bus stop, but if it doesn't bring you anywhere, it doesn't improve your accessibility. So that concludes very briefly what we found in looking into how it's adopted in planning. And basically it shows that there are big challenges for adopting accessibility indicators in planning. So what we found is that it's changing, but slowly. And with respect to the question, is there hopes? I think it's important to mention that there is hope. So we found that the main reason that people mentioned for integrating or adopting accessibility metrics in their work is because it was their own initiative and they had learned it somewhere. So by having future engineers, planner, and decision makers to be trained with accessibility gives us some hope for improving things in the future. And it also highlights the need to bridge the gap between research and planning. And that's where the question comes in. How do we go about developing measures that reflect the diversity of needs and the macro level components that do affect someone's accessibility? So how do we account for these needs while making sure that the measures we develop are simple enough to interpret and to be operationalized, to be brought into planning? So that concludes my presentation, and I want to thank all the people I worked with on developing accessibility measure, and I think we can open the floor for discussion or questions.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. That's a fantastic presentation, and I have to say it's super important. I think now in Latin America, also because several cities are implementing very important infrastructure projects for public transportation. In the case of Ecuador, we have the IOB in Guayaquil, we have the Metro de Quito, and the Tranvía, the tramway in Cuenca, that are super expensive infrastructures. And I think in several cases those infrastructures have not taken in account accessibility as a measure of the viability of the project. Just as you say, where the things are, but it's close to the stops and to the stations here, yes or not. But as you say, just having near a bus stop or a near metro station doesn't imply that you will improve your accessibility of people. So I think it's very encouraging, this lines of thought. We will open for the questions now. I want to take advantage now to welcome to our organizers of the seminar, Emilio Martinez from the research group in Estudios Sociales de Ciencia y Tecnología, and also Israel Drogo from Kaleidos. Israel is hiding somewhere there between among the spectators. I don't know. We were unable to bring him here to the main panel, but I will invite you all to write your questions directly in the chat or in the questions and answers. So if it's okay for you, I will start with the first question here, because what I like the most about your presentation is that you were insisting a lot of this individual needs, these specificities of different groups of people and so on. And that's I think that's something that is usually missing for the metrics that usually focus on general population. So first thing is in your studies and this review you presented in the last part of your presentation, there are some findings about that. I mean, are mobility plans considering these specificities from people? That I would like also to discuss a little bit, not just from the objective point of view, let's say in the sense of, you know, some physical impediments or something like that, or children and so on, but also from the subjective point of view. In the case of Latin America, and particularly in Ecuador, for example, for a lot of people, public transport is perceived as dangerous, as not suitable for children traveling alone, for example, or in some cases for women in late night and so on. So there are other, you know, nuances on these accessibility measures when you factor these other soft restrictions that people can have on the daily travel behavior. So can you reflect a little bit about that, please?
Yes, well, that's an interesting question, challenge that we're discussing a lot here with different partners. And I think that there's two aspects to it. So first, just having simple general measures of accessibility being implemented in practice is a good start, right? So we don't want to block anyone from using accessibility because it's not perfect measure. So the first goal I'd say is to put accessibility out there and make sure that people use it. And then there's different challenges. So the first things that you were mentioning were perceptions, and we're working on that. So trying through surveys to understand what are the perceptions of people. And I think we need more of these studies. And as you mentioned, these are context specific, right? So what someone can perceive as safe here in Montreal might not be the same as in Cuenca or Quito. And it might not be the same for different group of people. So I guess that the more fine-grained or detailed accessibility measures relate more to specific planning objectives for now. Ideally, in an ideal world, all accessibility measures that are used for large-scale planning would take into account these diversity. But what we're working on now more specifically is, yes, when we have specific objectives, for example, accessibility to parks for children. Well, then we look into the perception of children in Montreal. But yeah, it requires more efforts to look into the specificities of the context and of the people that we are targeting. So I think that's how I would see it. So there's the two objectives that we want to assess: the large scale, just bring accessibility out there, and then the specific objectives where we can go more in depth into how to adopt or how to adapt accessibility indicators.
So besides the what to measure, also how to measure. So are those general methodologies for measuring accessibility are really applicable for this specific populations or specific needs, or we need new methodologies and new metrics? I mean, because you know, you can just having some specific methodology applied for a certain population or a certain group, for example, where the children live, where disabled people or impaired people live, and just modify the metrics according to that information. Or maybe you need new metrics, new methodologies. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, that's a very good question. What comes to my mind is a bit the complementarity of accessibility indicators, which measure the potential you have around you, and then the actual behavior of individuals, right? So also looking at what are the actual behavior, the actual challenges, barriers experienced by individuals is extremely important, because accessibility is just one side of the story. And as you mentioned, it's impossible to have complete measure that capture everything. So also looking more specifically into the needs, problems, barriers, experiences of different groups of individuals, I think is necessary and complementary.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Luis Emilio, I don't know if you want to jump in. Welcome.
No alcanzo, no tengo por el momento alguna pregunta, Daniel.
Okay, so now maybe I will continue a little bit. My feeling related to these accessibility measures is that maybe now with the availability of data, mainly open data, so that's important in the case of Latin American cities where official data is scarce, that we for example use OpenStreetMap and other open source and voluntary information platforms. We can get that information. Also, we have tools. There are several open source tools that are each time more available and so on. And I think it's becoming easier each time, to implement those measures that you can provide some at least some simple metrics for accessibility. But what are the disadvantages of that? Because at certain point, I have a feeling that those metrics may oversimplify the whole picture. And if you only see the infrastructure, you only see the street network, the frequencies of the buses and so on, maybe you're missing another part of the picture, as you said before. So what are the specific disadvantages of that?
Yeah, well, two things on that, if I understand correctly your question. So the first one is about open data, and that is very interesting because when we asked in that survey respondents what was the main barriers for implementing accessibility measure, the two main barriers that were reported were lack of time and lack of data. And since we know that data is increasingly available, we feel that training people about how to develop accessibility metrics can help people overcome the data barrier. So the data exists, as you mentioned, maybe not all the level of details we want, but it does exist in some way to produce some measure of accessibility. So just informing people about that can be a good first step. And then your question about oversimplification and missing a part, that's a very relevant question. I think related to the macro scale planning, I think that it is an oversimplification, but less than using only mobility and transport indicators. So it contributes to the current planning practices by including the land use dimension into planning, which is extremely important, I think. And that's one of the potential of accessibility that is by default or by nature, it does bring together land use and transport planning. But then, yeah, it is for sure an oversimplification. And I think that, yeah, I think that as I was mentioning, it's important to be aware of the macro level planning, that's one thing. And then the micro level, looking at specific groups, specific areas, specific problems. It could be, for example, access to food resources, right? Maybe that's not so much at the macro level accessibility by public transport that we will look into it, but more looking specifically at local districts where people are in need of high quality food. So I think that's how I would see the compromise for now.
Okay, great. And I think I would like to also ask María Laura to jump in, because I think there is a nice connection in your both presentations. Maybe you, Genevieve, have presented the whole picture related to accessibility, and María Laura have talked a little bit more specific cases and also specific cities in our case, in Cuenca, Manta, and Bato, etc. So, how do you feel, María Laura? Are we going in Ecuador in the right direction, in the sense that are we already starting to measure accessibility and not just mobility indicators for the planning process? What's the experience of having the research close to the local authorities for planning? Are they already catching this concepts, or they are still in the just infrastructure part?
I think that on the hopeful side, I was happy to see that we somehow are, because many of the things we've done, many of the analysis we've done as a group kind of relate to what Genevieve showed us. For example, the accessibility to parks, we have a very similar analysis on who has access to what in terms of urban services. And right now we are working also for Metro Quito in trying to grasp or to count who has access to what, or to who is the service serving, actually. So I think we're going on the right track. What I would like to see is more municipalities adopting these techniques. I think that's important. And kind of in that sense, I also have a question for Genevieve. Since we're starting this process of collaboration between academia and local administrations, we've done a big effort to do it for the first time. So we've operationalized some tools, we've automatized them, we've done the first effort of planning, but I don't know if this will be useful or if this will be reapplied in 5 years to actually make an assessment of the system, if it's working, if it's still working for people, if it changed, if our way of life changed. So what I wanted to ask you in an older planning tradition or collaboration, how do you work with this thing, the continuity, accessibility, and making an assessment of urban systems?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge, and maybe related to my first question. I guess the first step is to have it once in there to show people that it's relevant, interesting, and it allows us. And the continuity, I think, is a bit like it seems you did in your study, that sorry, I'm mixed up between French, Spanish, and English now. Involving people, local actors in the process can help bringing some continuity in the use of those tools. For example, here in Montreal, we're working on a platform to calculate accessibility, but that is owned by an institution here in Montreal and not by the university. And hopefully they will, and that, not hopefully, they are definitely taking the lead on the project. So that's really interesting to see that. So I guess it relates a bit that we need to find local actors that are interested in that and that want to take the lead on that. And as part of this project, we also want to reach out to local organizations, so municipalities, local groups, with this platform and see how useful is it for you, how relevant, what would you like to see included. So I think that for now, we mainly looked at the spatial analysis, but what you're doing in Cuenca or in Quito, that working with local actors is essential to make sure that there's some, it won't be from year one that there will be a perfect tool that will be used every year to assess, but to bring accessibility into the mentality and hopefully have some people taking the lead for the future. And related to that, I had a question for you, María Laura. I was interested in how, so you said that you were doing a project looking at how well services serve people. And my question is one that often comes up with people who are working here. How do you decide on which services are important? And how do you decide on whether they serve people or not? Is it like a travel time threshold? Is it travel distance, cost? So I'd like to hear about how these choices are made. Who makes those choices? And are they mainly arbitrary or based on planning objectives or based on the context?
Well, funnily enough, I was about to ask you a very similar question based on a discussion we had yesterday in a meeting for the Metro Quito work. So you see,
Okay.
we were trying to measure the accessibility to job opportunities, kind of like counting, like you showed on the first indicator. But as we were discussing, we also saw that you can see it from the user perspective in how many opportunities do I access for consumption, for fun, for... So as users of the public system instead of potential workers, that's a different logic. And that logic also, what is more interesting is that it measures the actual weight of a land use, of how many people can it attract and how many trips it can generate. So actually we didn't reach an end in this discussion, which is why I wanted to ask you, what would you recommend in that sense? In the end, for our work, I think we're going with job opportunities because we have to end the job soon. But long term, I would like to know which one is preferable, which one would actually give us a better outlook on how well is a big transport system serving.
Well, I don't have an answer to that, but it's great to see that we have the same challenges everywhere. One thing that we noticed, and I mean, we didn't do extensive studies on that, but is that accessibility to jobs for public transport. So public transport is more at the regional or metropolitan level. Accessibility to job is a good proxy of things, right? So if you have jobs, if you have workers working somewhere, it's potentially because you have services, so restaurants, shops, governmental services. It's not perfect because you have some big office towers that are not relevant to the citizen but it's a first, again, I always start from how can we bring things forward? So it's a first step in integrating land use and transport. Then about what services should be accounted for, I don't have an answer. There's interestingly some basket of goods that have been developed through studies of basket of goods. And again, that's very specific. So mostly what we were looking at were European studies, and the importance of a bakery was in the basket of goods. Whereas here we don't have that strong tradition of everyone having access to a bakery, right? So I think it's very context dependent, and the same goes for Ecuador and Latin America. There's some realities that are so different from one place to another, right? That it's really difficult to have an answer to that. And maybe adding to that, we were talking about like which places attract most people, for example. I think that there's like some perspectives that we need to consider. So first, it can be based on the objective of the municipality, right? So they can decide as decision maker, elected officials, that green spaces are a priority for an area, right? So that could be really decided by the elected officials as representative of the wills of the population. So that wouldn't be one approach. The other, as you mentioned, is based on where do people go and what is important to them. The one aspect that we need to be careful with when we look at trial behavior is that it doesn't capture the latent demand, right? So people might not go to parks because they don't have parks around their house. So again, I think it comes back to Daniel's question about the methodologies, right? Data is important, quantitative data is important, but we always have to be aware that we might be missing something and that other approaches might be essential to really capture the full picture.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, what is the objective of a municipality, or what is the objective of a project, whomever might be trying, it's probably the main thing. And I think in that sense, probably healthier approach is to see it from the user. Who is the most vulnerable and who needs more help? It's the best system and take it from there, because the rest of people will have it sort of sorted, which is also something we think about when we work on projects for children and for the elderly, is this idea of attending to those who are the most vulnerable and having a city condition for them. And from there on, everyone else will have somehow sorted.
Yes, I think that you phrased it very well, that what matters is the users, right? We want to cater to the needs of the users, and that there's often challenges, a tension in public transport planning. I don't know if it's the case in Quito, but here, especially with the pandemic and the difficulty to recover users. So the tension between, we want to have the greatest number of users, so we want modal share to be higher. So we just want to cater to big job centers. So here it's downtown, right? Downtown is really well served, but other purposes, not so much, or other decentralized jobs, not so much. So I think that's where, María Laura, your perspective is very important, to look into users, and specifically the more vulnerable ones, or the less considered one. And it also comes back to women and men in public transport planning. What we see in Canada is that it's been largely based on accessibility to jobs at 8 a.m., which leads to a centralized system bringing downtown at 8 a.m. But typically, women are more likely to have localized jobs, not during peak hour, and they're also more likely to do trips not for job purposes, right? So again, looking at who are the users and what might be their diverse needs, I think is really interesting.
That's great. I think the conversation is going very interesting. There is also a question from one of the participants. First, I will read in Spanish, then I will translate for you into English, and then I will translate back at least part of your answer to Spanish again. La pregunta es de Carlos Urbano, dice: en lugares cercanos a las estaciones del metro de Quito, ¿cómo se puede proteger el acceso al suelo por parte de promotores inmobiliarios que se apoderan de estos predios altamente cotizados? So the question it's about how to protect these parcels, these places around the new metro stations that are being developed here in the case of Quito. Are there mechanisms for that? How, from the research perspective, can we provide some evidence or some answers to that? And I think it's a very interesting question, because we talked about a little bit about the dynamic of the accessibility as well. So sometimes we forget that the users, the city, and the infrastructure transforms over time in a kind of loop. So if you build an infrastructure like Metro de Quito, probably there is also going to, to produce some changes on the population, on the land uses, and the price of the land.
Yes, do you want me to go first, or María Laura, you want to jump in? Or? Yeah, I think what you said, I'll speak from my expertise. So I'm not I didn't do much research into governance or economics around the land use and how to control or govern it. But what you were mentioning, Daniel, that tying it into the framework of accessibility is important, right? So why are the prices, why do people want to use those lands? Well, it's because it provides accessibility to people and it's valued. So the promotores, I don't know, the promoter are really interested in those lands because it provides accessibility, right? And if you link it back to who needs accessibility, then it brings the question about, should we protect those areas? Probably yes, and for which usage, right? So I think tying back to who needs access, to what extent, and what are the policies at the municipality level to ensure this access.
Definitely, and I also think that this dynamic between accessibility and land price, it's super important, and sometimes it's forgetting by the authorities and the planners when they are trying, just planning a new infrastructure, and that's super typical here in Ecuador. There is a new road, there is a new access to the city, and immediately there is some speculation on the prices of the land. That's let's say a kind of normal and actually expected behavior, and it bugs me that it's not really taken into account when they are planning a mobility infrastructure. So I think that's very important to reflect on that.
Maybe I just want to jump in on that. We have the same problem here, and what we saw is, so we have a big light rail project for the western part of the city, and what we found is that the project was much more financed in terms of expert in transport, right? So they have a lot of expertise in transport infrastructure, modeling transport. But when it comes to urban planning, well, the expertise and the resources allocated to the planning of the urban areas, the cities around this infrastructure, is much lower. So that brings real challenges for cities, municipalities to be able to balance between the efforts put into transport planning and the need to put the same efforts into urban planning.
Totally agree. There is another question here. I will read for you. Also for I think it relates to both presentations, so you both are welcome to answer. María Laura Guerrero says it has been widely discussed that accessibility measures lack the empirical understanding of the environmental factors that affect and the surrounding benefit the nature and distribution of human activities on the streets, whereas vibrancy models are more accurate to determine attitudes and behavior in urban environments. A review tried to sort of models of this vibrancy concept. If so, what's your opinion on the pros and cons of each model?
Well, personally, I'm not familiar with the vibrancy models. I'd be interested in hearing more about it though. So I cannot really go more into details about the pros and cons of the approach.
Me, myself, I haven't used vibrancy models either, but it sounds quite interesting. As we have discussed, accessibility has also its limits. We can see only a few things at once, so it will be quite cool if we can integrate more things into the soup to have a broader idea of what we're actually measuring.
I also interested in this concept of vibrancy models. I'm not sure, I'm not really familiar with that, but if I had to guess, I will say that here Andrea maybe will be able to jump in. It's related to the complexity, to the concept related to complexity of the city. I mean, if I can define a vibrant place, it's a place where several things happen at the same time. This has been demonstrated related to mobility, in the sense that if you have an area of the city that has not just a high count of activities, but also high diversity. And here I'm borrowing some concepts from ecology, because we use a lot of measures of entropy for biodiversity, for example, for assessing natural areas or forests. So this concept can be translated to the city, and I think that brings a very interesting thing related to the complementariness of activities. You mentioned, Genevieve, at the beginning that when you have jobs, you assume that there will be also other activities around, like restaurants and so on, but sometimes that's not true, and sometimes that's actually a problem. And I'm wondering how easy it would be to you know, to change a little bit, maybe using the same methodologies, but just changing what you're measuring, and maybe not just activity counts, but activity diversity, or let's just say the kind of entropy in the rich area that you usually would measure accessibility. Let's say in an isochrone of 30 minutes. So how many different things you can do on that, not just how many things. So I think that's interesting, and maybe María Laura have also some experience on this kind of indicators.
We have been working, I think, on a tool that actually tried to combine different things into the isochrone. For example, the weight of quotidian activities. Very quotidian things like a bakery had a super high weight, and a hospital didn't, because it came from the logic of the user. How many times do you actually go to a bakery every day? Instead, to the hospital, hopefully a couple of times a year. One of the tools we've been trying has to do with that, and it combines this sort of weight by frequency attractivity with how many different things are in there. So combining both of them, and also with the accessibility by network, or the slope, which is something that we have to take a lot into account because we're located in the Andes. We try to make to create a measurement of how walkable, or how cyclable, or how good is an area for public transport, how good is it for sustainability, based on how many different and how many quotidian activities we would be reaching from a place. So that was one of our experiences, and it was quite interesting to do. We would have to put it to test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that combining the entropy or the diversity with the accessibility is central in really providing a complete, not complete, but a more complete picture of what people can access to. And I think what you did, María Laura, putting weights in terms of which destination are important, but also the diversity at the same time, I think is super relevant. We started something very similar, but at a very smaller scale, but a bit similar. It was the diversity of parks, right? So instead of saying how many parks do you have around you, do you have sports activities? Do you have nature activities? Do you have playgrounds for children? So just for parks, trying to see what's the diversity of things in there. And I think the challenge again is I'm very focused on the adoption, which is one thing. So yes, you need to develop more details and more appropriate measures that, as you were mentioning, Maria, you can test. Once you develop them, you can test to see if it reflects the perceptions or the need or the quality of life. And at the same time, you need to make sure you have measures that can be interpreted. So if it's a black box, it can be difficult to make its way into planning. So I think it's always about pushing a bit in both directions at the same time, so that eventually we get the best of both worlds. But it's really interesting to see that you did something like that with public transport. I'd be interested to see what comes up in terms of the diversity and the weights.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I think there is some final questions. One is something that I really liked about something that you said, Genevieve, about that the answers is the new planners. So the new generations, let's say the people who are now probably studying architecture, urban planning, etc. I see several of them here in attending this seminar. What do you think they are the answers? Maybe it's too late for those of us that are a little bit older. We are maybe having too many or too focused on traditional metrics and traditional ways of see the city. And that brings a very important thing of you know, how we are designing the curriculum for our schools, for our students at the universities. So would you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, well, one thing that crosses my mind when you reflect on that, I think that older planners can be young in our heart and learn new things and be leaders. So I don't want to discredit older planners or older decision maker. And about the curriculum, well, I think it comes with the multidisciplinary aspect, right? Either the curriculum of teaching, but also research projects. So it's challenging to go into the multidisciplinary range as you see, and as you're trying to improve. So I think that really it's essential to bring different people from different background into the same room. So for example, I'm teaching in civil engineering, but with a background in urban planning. So I think that that's really interesting to bring engineers to see the planner's perspective more. So I think that that's really key in supporting changes in that aspect. And also related to María Laura, so I speak from the engineering side because that's where I'm teaching, but bringing a bit more focus on the users. So not necessarily on the technical solution, but what is the real problem we're interested in? So it's not so much technical skills that are needed, but really change of mentality in approaching the problems and the planning. I'd be interested to hear from you both, Daniel and María Laura, on that question.
Thank you for your answers. María Laura, I don't know if you have some final thoughts on this.
Well, I was thinking if you are talking about young planners, I think I'm going to be doing this for a while. What would I see, or how would I approach things? Maybe if all logics try to be super efficient, I would probably think of now what would make us, what will give us more well-being, or what would make us happier. And from then on, developing tools and blah, 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 but setting up a goal that has to do with being okay, instead of being profitable.
Mm-hmm.
Really like that. Okay, I think we are reaching the end of today's session. I have but just a lot of thanks for you both for sharing your research, your experience, your thoughts with us. I think it has been a very enriching discussion today, and I just want to remind our participants that you will be able to access to a certificate for this seminar if you attend at least 3 of the 4 sessions. I will share a little bit with you what the next sessions will be, or who will be in the few next sessions, and also the dates. So we will have Paola Girón in the next session. That's going to be 17th of November. Paola Girón is a researcher from Universidad de Chile. Then we will have in November 23, Margarita Green, also from Chile, but from Universidad Católica, and also she's director of Redeus. And finally, the last session, we will have Ignacio Farias from Humboldt University on December the 3rd. All the sessions are at the same time, at 11:30 o'clock Ecuador time. I will just remember about the certificate that you can get. Please, you need to fill this form and at least 3 sessions. I have just put the link in the chat so you all can access also to the form. Esta es la primera y la última sesión en inglés. Las otras sesiones van a ser en español, así que también esperamos que que más personas puedan acceder. Les agradezco enormemente la participación el día de hoy. Les recuerdo también que el seminario está grabado, quedará grabado y publicado también en nuestras páginas web. Genevieve, María Laura, thank you very, very much for your participation today, and see you in the next session.
Thank you very much.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.